On a frozen February morning in 2008, in the quiet industrial town of Lincoln Park, Michigan, a young woman named Chelsea Bruck left a Halloween party dressed as Poison Ivy and was never seen alive again. The 22-year-old had been laughing with friends just hours before, her green costume catching the glow of string lights, her face painted with theatrical precision. By dawn, her phone went silent. Her car sat abandoned in a church parking lot. And for nearly 6 years, the question that haunted southeastern Michigan remained unanswered. What happened to Chelsea Bruck on that October night when the music stopped and the laughter died? This is the story of how a community's worst suspicions became a documented nightmare, how a single photograph unlocked a confession, and how justice arrived not with sirens, but with a quiet knock on a door in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The city of Lincoln Park sits just south of Detroit, a working-class community of 38,000 residents pressed between the factories of River Rouge and the suburban sprawl of Wayne County. In 2008, it was a place where people knew their neighbors, where children rode bicycles down cracked sidewalks beneath October maples turning crimson and gold, where the smell of burning leaves mixed with the industrial haze that drifted south from the automotive plants. The neighborhoods consisted of small brick homes with chain-link fences, American flags hanging from porch posts, pickup trucks parked in driveways. It was not the kind of place where young women vanished without explanation. It was not the kind of place where anyone expected to search the woods for a body. Chelsea Bruck had grown up in these streets. She was the oldest of 3 siblings, a graduate of Lincoln Park High School who worked at a logistics company and lived with her boyfriend in a modest apartment on the west side of town. Those who knew her described a young woman with an infectious laugh, someone who made elaborate Halloween costumes each year, who texted her mother multiple times daily, who never missed a shift at work without calling. On October 25, 2008, she had spent the afternoon at her parents' house, helping her younger sister carve pumpkins on the front porch. The air had been crisp that day, the kind of autumn cold that made people pull their jackets tight, the kind that smelled of wood smoke and coming rain. She had left her parents' home around 6 in the evening, promising to stop by the next morning for pancakes. Her mother would later recall standing at the window, watching Chelsea's small sedan pull away from the curb, the taillights disappearing around the corner of Fort Street. That night, Chelsea attended a large Halloween party at a converted barn on Haggerty Road, just west of the Belleville city limits. The party drew several hundred people, most of them in their early 20s, most of them connected through overlapping social circles from high schools across Wayne County. Chelsea arrived around 9:30, her green Poison Ivy costume complete with silk leaves and theatrical makeup. She had driven alone, parking her white Chevrolet Malibu near the entrance. Witnesses would later remember seeing her near the bonfire, talking with friends, holding a red plastic cup, smiling in photographs that would eventually be examined by investigators with magnifying glasses and forensic software. The temperature that night dropped to 38 degrees. A light mist began falling around midnight, turning the dirt parking area into slick mud. The last confirmed sighting of Chelsea Bruck occurred at approximately 1:15 in the morning on October 26th. A friend saw her walking toward the parking area with an unknown individual, a man in a dark jacket whose face remained obscured in the dim light. The friend called out to Chelsea, but she did not respond or turn around. She simply continued walking, her green costume disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. When her boyfriend tried calling her cell phone at 2:30 in the morning, it went directly to voicemail. By 3 o'clock, when she had not returned home, he began calling friends. By 5 o'clock, he was driving the route between the party location and their apartment, searching the shoulders of the road with his headlights cutting through the fog. At 7:15 on Sunday morning, October 26th, Chelsea's father called the Monroe County Sheriff's Department to report his daughter missing. Deputies arrived at the barn property on Haggerty Road at 8:45 that morning. The scene they encountered resembled the aftermath of any large outdoor gathering. Empty bottles scattered across the grass, tire tracks crisscrossing the muddy field, a few remaining partygoers sleeping in vehicles. Chelsea's white Malibu sat in the church parking lot adjacent to the property, locked and undamaged. Her purse remained inside, along with her identification, her apartment keys, and $17 in cash. Her cell phone was never recovered. Investigators interviewed more than 50 witnesses that first day, constructing a timeline that placed Chelsea at the party between 9:30 and 1:15, but no one could definitively identify the person she had been walking with in those final moments. Descriptions varied. Some said he wore a camouflage jacket, others remembered dark clothing. One witness thought perhaps she had seen a white truck leaving the property around 1:30, but could not be certain. The search for Chelsea Bruck began in earnest on Monday, October 27th. Monroe County organized teams of volunteers who walked grid patterns through the cornfields surrounding the party location, their boots crunching through dried stalks, their eyes scanning the ground for any trace of green fabric or disturbed earth. The Michigan State Police deployed helicopters that circled overhead, thermal imaging cameras sweeping the wooded areas along the Huron River. Bloodhounds tracked scents from Chelsea's car to a point approximately 300 yards into the adjacent forest, then lost the trail near a dirt access road used by utility workers. Local television stations broadcast her photograph every evening. A smiling young woman with brown hair and dark eyes, the green costume from the party, the last image of someone who had simply wanted to celebrate Halloween with friends. Those who knew the family said the waiting became its own form of torment. Chelsea's mother stopped sleeping, instead sitting at the kitchen table through the night, her phone placed on the wood surface where she could see it, waiting for a call that never came. Her father drove the roads around Belleville every morning before work, studying the ditches and tree lines, looking for anything the official searches might have missed. Her siblings printed thousands of flyers and taped them to storefronts across Wayne and Monroe counties. Missing Chelsea Bruck, last seen October 26, 2008. The community rallied with a desperation that felt both generous and helpless. Fundraisers filled local restaurants. Vigils drew hundreds of people holding candles in the October wind. But beneath the public solidarity, investigators were beginning to focus their attention on a narrower set of possibilities. Among the witnesses interviewed in those first days was a 28-year-old construction worker named Daniel Clay from Newport, Michigan, a small community about 15 miles southeast of the party location. Clay had attended the Halloween event with several friends, arriving around 10 in the evening and leaving, according to his initial statement, around midnight. He told deputies he had not spoken with Chelsea Bruck and did not recognize her from the photographs they showed him. He described his costume as a zombie, complete with torn clothing and face paint. He said he had driven straight home after the party, arriving around 12:30, and had spent Sunday working on his truck in his driveway. His demeanor during the interview was described in the incident report as calm and cooperative. Nothing in that first conversation raised immediate suspicion. But small details began accumulating in the investigators' files. A witness came forward on October 30th, claiming to have seen Daniel Clay talking with a woman in a green costume near the bonfire around 12:45. Another partygoer provided a photograph from the event that showed Clay in the background of a shot that also captured Chelsea, the two of them standing perhaps 20 feet apart near the barn entrance. When deputies returned to interview Clay on November 3rd, they asked about these discrepancies. He acknowledged that he might have been mistaken about the time he left. Perhaps it was closer to 1 o'clock, and yes, Now that they mentioned it, he did remember seeing someone in a green costume, though he had not spoken with her. When asked about the photograph showing them in apparent proximity, he shrugged and said it was a large party and people moved around. Investigators obtained Clay's cell phone records on November 7th. The data showed his phone had been active in the area of the party until 1:37 in the morning, then had pinged off a tower near his home in Newport at 2:14. The drive between those two locations typically took 18 minutes. The extra time, Clay explained when questioned on November 10th, was because he had stopped at a gas station to buy cigarettes. Surveillance footage from gas stations along the route showed no sign of his vehicle. When deputies asked which specific station, Clay said he could not remember. It had been late and he had been tired. The conversation ended with Clay becoming visibly agitated, stating that he felt he was being accused of something he had not done, demanding to know if he needed an attorney. Deputies assured him this was routine questioning and thanked him for his cooperation. The investigation reached a critical juncture on November 15th when forensic analysis of Chelsea's vehicle revealed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Her car had been locked when discovered, suggesting she had left it voluntarily or had been unable to return to it. Investigators began working under the theory that Chelsea had gotten into another vehicle at the party, either willingly or under circumstances that prevented her from resisting. They reviewed registration records for everyone who had attended the event, looking for connections to Chelsea, searching for any previous incidents or complaints. Daniel Clay's name appeared on the list. His truck, a white Ford F-150, matched the general description provided by the witness who thought she had seen a white truck leaving around 1:30. On November 20th, investigators obtained a search warrant for Clay's property. The search of Daniel Clay's home and vehicle occurred on November 21, 2008. Deputies arrived at his residence on Mason Road at 6:30 in the morning, the sky still dark with winter coming early that year, frost covering the windows of the small ranch house where Clay lived alone. They seized his truck, his computers, his cell phone, and numerous items of clothing. They photographed his bedroom, his basement, his garage. They took samples from his truck bed and cab interior. They brought in cadaver dogs who alerted near the rear passenger side of the vehicle, though subsequent testing revealed no biological evidence. Clay watched the search from his front porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, he declined and requested an attorney. The search yielded nothing definitive. No physical evidence linked Daniel Clay to Chelsea Bruck's disappearance. No witnesses could place them together after 1:15 in the morning. No confession emerged. By December, the active investigation began to slow. The winter of 2008 passed in frozen silence. Chelsea's family maintained their vigil, but the searches decreased in frequency as snow covered the fields and the woods became impassable. The media attention shifted to other stories. Daniel Clay returned to his job at a commercial construction firm in Monroe, his life resuming its ordinary patterns while Chelsea remained missing. Deputies continued following leads, interviewing peripheral witnesses, reviewing evidence, but the case had entered that terrible liminal space where everyone suspected the truth, but no one could prove it. Those who worked the investigation later described the frustration of knowing someone was responsible but lacking the single piece of evidence that would allow an arrest. The file grew thicker. The calendar turned to 2009. Chelsea Bruck's face stared out from posters that faded in storefront windows. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the poisonous weight of suspicion growing in quiet moments, the months after Chelsea's disappearance became a study in deterioration. Her family existed in a state of permanent emergency, their lives suspended between hope and grief. Her mother lost 40 pounds. Her father developed insomnia so severe that he eventually required medical intervention. Her siblings struggled to return to school, unable to concentrate on homework when their sister remained somewhere unknown. The community wanted to help but did not know how. Vigils became routine. Searches became seasonal. And beneath it all ran the current of questions that no one wanted to speak aloud. Was she alive somewhere? Had she run away? Or was she already gone, lying in some unmarked place where the ground had simply swallowed her whole? Spring arrived in 2009 with its cruel beauty. The fields around the party location bloomed with wildflowers. The woods filled with birdsong. Volunteers organized another comprehensive search on the one-year anniversary of Chelsea's disappearance, October 25, 2009. More than 300 people walked the same cornfields and forests that had been searched 12 months earlier, hopping that time, and weather might have revealed what had remained hidden. They found nothing. By November 2009, the investigation had effectively stalled. Deputies still took calls about the case. They still followed up on tips that came in sporadically. But the active pursuit had diminished to periodic reviews of the existing evidence and occasional re-interviews of witnesses whose memories had not changed. Daniel Clay, meanwhile, lived his life with an apparent normality that some found disturbing. He continued working construction. He dated occasionally. He spent weekends hunting and fishing in the rural areas south of Monroe County. On the surface, nothing about his behavior suggested guilt or remorse. But those who knew him said something had changed after the search of his home. He became more guarded, less social, quicker to anger when the subject of Chelsea Bruck arose in conversation. He stopped attending the kinds of large gatherings where people drank and music played late into the night. He kept to himself, his routines predictable: work, home, the occasional trip to his family's property in Lenawee County. Investigators maintained periodic surveillance, documenting his movements, looking for any deviation that might indicate consciousness of guilt. They found nothing actionable. The years accumulated like sediment. 2010 became 2011. Chelsea's family relocated to a different county, unable to continue living in the place where every street corner held memories. Her mother started a foundation in Chelsea's name, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons. Her father became an advocate for improved investigative resources for cold cases. Her siblings grew older, carrying the weight of their sister's absence into their own adult lives. The case appeared in various media retrospectives, usually around the October anniversary, brief segments reminding viewers that Chelsea Bruck remained missing, and anyone with information should contact the Monroe County Sheriff's Department. Tips continued to arrive, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere. The file remained open but inactive, a stack of documents representing thousands of hours of work that had produced no arrest and no resolution. The break came not from investigative brilliance or forensic technology, but from the simple passage of time and the accumulated weight of conscience. In April 2014, nearly 6 years after Chelsea's disappearance, a woman contacted the Monroe County Sheriff's Department with information about Daniel Clay. The woman, whose name was withheld from public records, had dated Clay briefly in late 2013. During their relationship, she said, Clay had made statements that troubled her, references to the Chelsea Bruck case that suggested knowledge beyond what had been publicly reported. He had described the party in detail despite claiming, in his original statement, that he barely remembered the event. He had mentioned Chelsea by name during a conversation about Halloween parties, then had quickly changed the subject when pressed. Most significantly, during an argument in February 2014, he had said something the woman found chilling enough to warrant calling authorities. He had said, according to her statement, that people were stupid to think anyone would ever find her, that the woods were too big, and no one looked in the right places. Investigators reopened the case with renewed intensity on April 17, 2014. They re-interviewed witnesses from the original investigation, now 6 years older, some of them with different recollections or additional details they had not initially considered important. They reviewed every photograph taken at the party, using enhanced imaging software to track Daniel Clay's movements throughout the evening. They discovered that Clay appeared in the background of 17 different photographs, his location at the party moving in a pattern that roughly corresponded with Chelsea's own movements as documented by witnesses. At 12:53, a photograph showed Clay standing near the parking area, looking toward the camera with an expression that investigators would later describe as watchful. At 1:07, another photograph captured him in conversation with someone off-camera, near the location where Chelsea was last seen. The timeline was circumstantial but suggestive. On May 2, 2014, investigators made a decision that would prove crucial. They organized another large-scale search of the area surrounding the party location, this time using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained specifically for long-term remains detection. The search focused on wooded areas within a 5-mile radius of Haggerty Road, particularly locations that would have been accessible by vehicle but were off main roads. On May 4th, a handler working near a gravel access road approximately 4 miles southeast of the party location reported that her dog had alerted. The location was a small clearing surrounded by dense second-growth forest, accessible only by a rutted 2-track that branched off a service road used by power company maintenance vehicles. The ground was covered in years of fallen leaves and undergrowth. Investigators brought in cadaver excavation specialists. They found Chelsea Bruck on May 5, 2014, buried in a shallow grave beneath 4 inches of sandy soil and forest debris. She was still wearing the green costume she had worn to the party, the fabric now decomposed but still recognizable. Forensic analysis would later determine that she had been placed in the ground within hours of her death, likely before dawn on October 26, 2008. The location was remote enough that casual hikers would never encounter it, but accessible enough that someone driving a truck could reach it in darkness. The medical examiner determined cause of death could not be definitively established due to decomposition, but the circumstances strongly suggested asphyxiation. There were no defensive wounds on her remains, no signs of prolonged struggle. The evidence suggested she had either been unconscious or had been overcome quickly. The discovery of Chelsea's body transformed the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide. The Monroe County Sheriff's Department, working with the Michigan State Police, established a dedicated task force on May 6th. They returned to Daniel Clay's original statements, noting every inconsistency, every detail that did not align with the physical evidence. They mapped his cell phone location data against the position where Chelsea's body was found, discovering that the service road accessing the burial site ran within half a mile of Clay's family property in Lenawee County. They interviewed his family members, his coworkers, his former girlfriends. A pattern emerged of a man who was charming on the surface but who had a history of troubling behavior. An assault charge from 2004 that had been dismissed, multiple complaints from former romantic partners about controlling behavior, a reputation among friends for aggressive responses when drinking. On May 20th, 2014, investigators conducted their most extensive interview yet with Daniel Clay. They met him at the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, in a small room with cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor. Clay arrived with his attorney, a local criminal defense lawyer who had represented him during the 2008 search of his home. For 3 hours, deputies presented Clay with the accumulated evidence: the cell phone data, the photographs from the party, the witness statements placing him near Chelsea in her final moments, the proximity of the burial site to his family property. They did not directly accuse him but made clear that every piece of evidence pointed toward his involvement. Clay's attorney advised him to remain silent. Clay himself said almost nothing, his jaw clenched, his hands folded on the table's surface. Near the end of the interview, Detective Richard Hoffman leaned forward and said, according to the transcript, "We found her, Daniel. Chelsea's family can finally bury their daughter, but they need to know what happened that night. They need to understand why." Daniel Clay did not confess during that interview. He left the sheriff's department with his attorney, climbed into his truck and drove home to Newport. But something had shifted. Investigators noticed increased activity in his cell phone records, calls to family members and friends, conversations that suggested someone preparing for consequences. Surveillance teams reported that Clay appeared agitated, packing in his driveway late at night, burning papers in a barrel behind his garage. On May 27th, exactly 3 weeks after Chelsea's body was discovered, Daniel Clay contacted the sheriff's department and requested to speak with detectives. He arrived without his attorney. He asked for a recording device to be turned on, and he began to talk. The confession came in fragments, delivered in a flat monotone that witnesses would later describe as disturbingly emotionless. Clay said he had met Chelsea near the bonfire around midnight. They had talked. She had been friendly. They had walked toward the parking area together. He claimed everything that followed was an accident, though he provided no explanation that made coherent sense. He said she had gotten into his truck voluntarily. He said they had driven to the family property in Lenawee County. He said she had become upset about something he could not articulate. He said there had been a struggle, though he could not describe what prompted it. He said she had stopped breathing. He said he had panicked and buried her in the woods, intending to return later to move the body but never doing so. The entire statement took 47 minutes. When it concluded, Clay sat in silence while Detective Hoffman read him his rights and placed him under arrest for homicide. The arrest of Daniel Clay on May 27, 2014, generated immediate media attention. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast the news. Chelsea's family released a statement expressing relief that their daughter had been found and that someone would be held accountable, though they noted that no arrest could bring Chelsea back or restore what had been stolen from their family. The community response divided along predictable lines. Those who had suspected Clay all along felt vindicated, while others expressed shock that someone they knew as a neighbor and coworker could have committed such an act. Clay's employer issued a statement saying he had been terminated immediately. His family declined to comment publicly, though court records would later show they hired a prominent criminal defense team from Detroit. The legal proceedings stretched across more than a year. Daniel Clay was formally charged in June 2014 with first-degree homicide, concealment of a body, and tampering with evidence. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment, his expression blank as the judge read the charges in a Monroe County courtroom filled with Chelsea's family and supporters. The prosecution built their case on the accumulated circumstantial evidence. The timeline discrepancies, the cell phone data, the photographs placing Clay near Chelsea, the burial location's proximity to his property, and most significantly, his confession, which defense attorneys immediately sought to suppress, arguing it had been coerced and was unreliable. The judge denied the suppression motion, ruling that Clay had voluntarily contacted authorities and had been properly advised of his rights. The trial of Daniel Clay began in August 2015, nearly 7 years after Chelsea Bruck disappeared from the Halloween party on Haggerty Road. The courtroom in downtown Monroe was packed each day with observers, journalists, and Chelsea's family, who sat in the front row behind the prosecution table. Over 3 weeks, jurors heard testimony from more than 50 witnesses, friends who had seen Chelsea at the party, investigators who had worked the case, forensic experts who analyzed the cell phone data and physical evidence, the medical examiner who described the condition of Chelsea's remains. They listened to the recording of Clay's confession, his voice flat and affectless as he described what he had done. The prosecution presented a narrative of predatory behavior. A man who had targeted a vulnerable young woman, who had lured her away from the safety of her friends, who had taken her life when she resisted his advances, and who had buried her in the woods with the calculation of someone who believed he would never be caught. The defense offered an alternative theory built on reasonable doubt. Clay's attorneys argued that the confession had been obtained through psychological pressure, that their client had been worn down by years of suspicion and had simply told investigators what they wanted to hear. They questioned the reliability of the cell phone data, suggesting the timeline was not as precise as prosecutors claimed. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence directly linking Clay to Chelsea's death, the absence of DNA or forensic material in his truck or on her remains. They suggested that other party-goers could have been responsible, that the investigation had focused too narrowly on their client because he had been uncooperative in the early stages. They portrayed Clay as someone who made poor decisions in the aftermath of witnessing something he did not commit, someone who had buried Chelsea's body after finding her deceased, but who had not caused her death. The explanation struck most observers as desperate and implausible. The jury deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days in early September 2015. On September 4th, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: first-degree homicide, concealment of a body, and tampering with evidence. Chelsea's mother wept silently as the verdict was read, her husband's arm around her shoulders, her daughter's photograph clutched in her hands. Daniel Clay showed no visible reaction, his face expressionless as deputies prepared to return him to the county facility. The judge scheduled sentencing for October, citing the need to prepare victim impact statements and pre-sentence reports. When the courtroom emptied that afternoon, Chelsea's family remained in their seats for nearly an hour, unable or unwilling to leave the place where their daughter's case had finally reached a legal conclusion. The sentencing hearing occurred on October 16, 2015, exactly 7 years and 2 days after Chelsea Bruck attended a Halloween party and never came home. The courtroom again filled with observers, the atmosphere heavy with the accumulated grief of those years. Chelsea's mother addressed the court first, reading from a prepared statement that described the daughter they had lost, her kindness, her ambition, her love for her family. She described the years of waiting, the agony of not knowing, the permanent wound that Daniel Clay had inflicted not just on Chelsea, but on everyone who loved her. She said that no sentence could restore what had been taken, but she hoped the court would ensure Clay never had the opportunity to harm another family. Chelsea's father spoke next, his voice breaking as he described finding his daughter's childhood bedroom exactly as she had left it, her high school yearbook still on the shelf, her Halloween decorations still in boxes in the closet. He said Clay had stolen not just Chelsea's life but their family's future, the grandchildren they would never meet, the weddings they would never attend, the simple joy of Sunday dinners together. Daniel Clay declined to make a statement at his sentencing. His attorney spoke briefly, asking for mercy and nodding that Clay had a family who loved him and believed in his fundamental decency despite the jury's verdict. The judge, A veteran of the Monroe County bench named Margaret No delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of Clay's actions. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree homicide conviction, with additional consecutive sentences for the concealment and tampering charges. She noted that Clay had shown no remorse, had offered no explanation that accounted for the evidence, and had demonstrated through his years of silence a fundamental disregard for Chelsea's family and their suffering. She said that justice required not just punishment but acknowledgement, and that Clay's refusal to accept responsibility made maximum incarceration the only appropriate response. As deputies led him from the courtroom, Clay glanced once at his own family seated in the back row, then disappeared through the door that led to the holding cells. The conclusion of Daniel Clay's trial brought a measure of closure to Chelsea Bruck's family, though closure proved to be an inadequate word for what they experienced. Their daughter had been found. Her perpetrator had been convicted and sentenced. The legal system had functioned as intended, but none of this restored what had been lost on that October night in 2008 when Chelsea walked away from a bonfire and into darkness. The foundation her mother established continued its work supporting other families navigating similar tragedies. Her father became an advocate for legislative changes that would improve coordination between law enforcement agencies in missing persons investigations. Her siblings moved forward with their lives, carrying Chelsea's memory in ways both public and intensely private. For the community of Lincoln Park and the surrounding areas, the case became a reminder of how ordinary evil can appear, how someone can attend the same parties, work the same jobs, live the same neighborhoods, and harbor the capacity for profound violence. Investigators who worked the case later reflected on the importance of persistence, noting that justice arrived not through a single breakthrough, but through the accumulated weight of evidence gathered over years. The photographs from the party, which seemed merely documentary at first, became crucial timeline anchors. The cell phone data, initially inconclusive, revealed its significance only when compared with the burial location discovered 6 years later. The ex-girlfriend's statement, arriving years after the initial investigation, provided the final push that reopened a case many assumed would never be solved. Chelsea Bruck was buried in a cemetery in Monroe County on May 17, 2014, 12 days after her remains were discovered. The service drew hundreds of mourners, many of whom had searched for her in the weeks and months after her disappearance. Her tombstone bears her name, her dates of birth and death, and a single line: "Forever 22, forever loved." The green costume she wore that Halloween night was preserved as evidence and remains in the custody of the Michigan State Police. The barn where the party occurred has since been demolished, the property sold and redeveloped. The access road where her body was found has been gated and posted with no trespassing signs. The only memorial at the site is a small wooden cross, placed by Chelsea's family, marked with her initials and the date she disappeared. Daniel Clay is currently incarcerated at the Chippewa Correctional Facility in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. He has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. He has given no interviews and has made no further statements about the night Chelsea Bruck died. The investigation file, which spans multiple bankers' boxes in the Monroe County Sheriff's Department records facility, has been closed with the notation, "Cleared by arrest and conviction." The case is occasionally cited in law enforcement training materials as an example of effective cold case investigation, and Chelsea's story appears periodically in true crime documentaries and podcasts, each retelling another opportunity to remember that she was more than a victim, more than a case number, more than a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk at ordinary gatherings. This story matters because Chelsea Bruck mattered. She was a daughter who texted her mother daily, a sister who carved pumpkins on autumn afternoons, a young woman who made elaborate costumes and worked hard at her job and looked forward to Sunday morning pancakes with her family. She was 22 years old when she died, her life full of ordinary dreams and everyday kindnesses. What happened to her on October 26, 2008, was not inevitable or unavoidable. It was a choice made by someone who valued his own desires above another person's right to exist. Justice, when it finally arrived, could not undo that choice or restore that life. But it could and did affirm that Chelsea's life had value, that her absence mattered, that society would not forget or abandon the work of holding accountable those who destroy what they cannot create. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.